When impossible ports are mentioned in the same breath as the N64, Resident Evil 2 is always the first game which springs to mind. It's a technical marvel which shouldn't have any right existing on the Nintendo 64, and yet somehow the wizards at Capcom managed to do the impossible and release one of the console's most beloved ports. But equally impressive was the year 2000 release of Starcraft 64. Sure, the console had real-time strategy games before it, such as Command & Conquer, but you could even argue elements of Battlezone fall into the same category. But Command & Conquer in particular was a port of a much older PC game, whereas Starcraft was a much newer franchise which could even push PCs of the era with the right settings. So how did mass media and Blizzard, along with some help from Nintendo, bring one of the hottest PC games of 1998 to the Nintendo 64? It's a story of development highs and development hells, which ultimately left the studio famously proclaiming they would never do a console port again. Development of Starcraft 64 began in 1998 as early as April. It was announced that the studio were looking at console ports already, but at that time they had no firm systems to announce. The project was planned to be as much of a port of the PC original as possible. The console port was developed by Blizzard and Mass Media Entertainment, who at the time were a subsidiary of THQ. And I'll link up a whole video I did about Mass Media Entertainment's work on the N64 in the description box. Originally planned to be a very quick conversion project, the limitations of the N64 hardware really began to take a strain on the game's development, and unsurprisingly the release date was pushed back from late 99 to mid 2000. During this time, the previews of the game were surprisingly negative to neutral at best. By this time the PC version of the game had taken on a life of its own with a huge player base and the PvP element of the game being an absolute smash hit. So with no online play and clearly downgraded graphics, anyone viewing the game with any background whatsoever in gaming of the time will have likely seen this as shaping up to be a massive flop. But the studio persevered, and with Nintendo publishing the game, no doubt drawn to the appeal of having a hit PC title coming to the console, they lent the team the producer talents of their very own David Brigham to help the, well, let's face it, struggling project. With problems in the game being ironed out over an extended development time and a final release date being set, the negative previews of the game did nothing to dampen the appetite for the game's release, and the full initial and only production cycle of the game sold out to retailers in a matter of days. Just before the game's release on the N64, Mass Media described taking on Starcraft 64 as a nearly absurd undertaking, and they vowed to never take on another PC port for consoles unless they were certain that there wouldn't have to be as many compromises to get the final game published. So with Starcraft on PC still being alive and played even to this day, what did N64 gamers get when it came to the final game that summer of 2000? Well, a damn fine title if I do say so myself, but one which shouldn't be seen as a port of the PC game, which I'll come back to later. Starting off, when talking about N64 games storylines, I've often said it's not Shakespeare, and it's a line which I've become known for. N64 games, like many of the time, were not designed and conceived to have huge epic grand scale storylines and vast canon to delve into. Although Final Fantasy VII broke the mould, it was still uncommon for the time to get much more than a Save the Princess type storyline in a game. Well, my N64kers, finally we have a game that is Shakespeare. The world of Starcraft 64 embraces three unique and different races, the Terran, the Protoss and the Zerg. To fully complete the game, you'll need to play through three huge campaigns and master each race's unique gameplay abilities and styles, as they genuinely feel like playing three completely different species. Given that they're all essentially at war across the galaxy, you'll traverse planets and terrain as you engage in an intertwining storyline with huge depth, some cool plot twists, and characters who are extremely well written and have depth and personality to boot. It was this unique personality given to each of the game's races that really made this title stand out on its release. Although the N64 version doesn't have voice acting, The text in both storyline and mission objectives really delivers a game's plot in a depth rarely seen in N64 games. But it's not just the stock Starcraft experience you get here. The game contains the late 1998 Brood War expansion, which further expands on the storyline and events from the base game to further engross you into the world building the studio was creating for the franchise. What the game does so well is presenting the different races, motivations and traits so well throughout the entire story. Whilst the game flat out suggests you should play them in a correct order, and it's something that you can bypass, I would actually suggest that you do heed the studio's advice. Whilst you start as the Terran forces, you'll quickly learn that they're not your expected hero type race, and as you play the other races in the storyline, you'll go from seeing the different races as enemies to races that you can sympathise with when you play through the game from their perspective. It's a multi-dimensional interplanetary offering, and if the game grips you, like it did me, you'll be keen to play through all of the campaigns and side missions to fully understand the complex story being told here. Be warned though, it's a lengthy experience, and one which you can invest a lot of time into understanding all of the lore on offer. Now perhaps the biggest criticism of the game however can be levelled at its graphics. Even with the expansion pack being supported, it's not actually used to bump the visuals, instead it's required to run other gameplay elements like the Brood War expansion and the game's multiplayer mode. In game it's not exactly a looker, but I think the studio did an amicable job working within the limitations the console presented. The game menus are all in high resolution, but this is in stark contrast to the clearly standard resolution models and textures when you're actually in game. One of the core focuses of all of the game's preview was just how much of a downgrade the gameplay visuals were in comparison to the PC version. But in the same way that Command & Conquer was on N64 years before, you're just going to have to overlook this and focus on the gameplay. Now yes, things do look muddy, it's the N64 so that's a given most of the time, but I think there's enough texture quality and variation here to not be half as bad looking as some people make it out to be. The biggest downgrade though is noticeable when you have lots of buildings and troops on screen. When you cluster a few together it can be hard to identify single units, and sometimes when you have special characters in your ranks, locating them just by looking at the screen can be problematic. The buildings too have much more limited frames of animation, and although there's still quite enough here to give them some sort of life, don't be expecting much other than the ability to quickly identify which building does what. In contrast, I did like the amount of gore in the game, and they weren't shy with splattering the crimson all over the place when battles are undertaken, which really adds to the combat feel. Sure, it's not 3D, but the sprite work in the game isn't as jarring as some people make it out to be. To be honest, when there's so many titles that fail to transition into 3D, it's refreshing to see a game stick to the sprite work, and so they did a fair job of it. Now PC purists will naturally smirk at the graphics here, but even the inclusion of some pretty rough around the edges FMV was still something rarely seen on the console at the time. Like many games though, it's when the gameplay kicks in, it's where a game can be made or broken, and thankfully I think the developer pretty much nailed it here. Each race has basic tutorials to walk you through teaching their core mechanics, and then you're off on your own to do the main campaigns to figure the rest of the game out. Just a short note on this, I will add that the tutorials really only do give you the basics, and so very quickly you'll be given access to new units and buildings with very little to help explain to you what they're actually for. If you're new to Starcraft then you may want to clue yourself up or expect quite a bit of trial and error. With each of the three races having different paths, there's a total of just under 60 missions to play through, including the console exclusive mission, which is actually pretty decent. On top of that, there are set scenarios which you can play through, which more for the experienced players, they tend to kick you into action at a much quicker speed than the more progressive nature of the main campaigns. The campaigns themselves are deep and there's actually a nice amount of challenge here, albeit with some big pacing issues. For example, one of the earlier Terran missions sees you holding your base for 30 minutes until your pickup arrives. Then shortly after, the next mission can be completed in a matter of minutes if you take the right route. Now it does help to mix things up, and sometimes when you get to one of the quicker missions it feels like a godsend after sometimes spending over an hour on a single mission. These shorter missions also typically don't require you to do any base building and instead give you a set squad unit to take on an infiltration or escort mission. Yes, I said escort missions, but don't worry, they aren't half as painful as they can be in other games. Now once you've mastered the game, you can also set up your own battles using a variety of terrains and up to 3 other computer AI opponents to play against. Now these aren't quite as enjoyable as going one-on-one with a friend, and yes, the game does have multiplayer co-op and PvP. For me personally though, I would have scrapped the multiplayer in the game altogether. It's technically impressive to see in the game, but when playing against each other you can obviously see what your opponent is up to, which takes away half of the fun, especially against an experienced player who can quickly realise, well, you've got no chance of winning. What really drags the gameplay though is the frame rate, which is the elephant in the room. When first playing, it really isn't that noticeable. After all, you're given limited access to units and buildings and more simplistic missions. When you get further into each campaign however, you'll have more and more units on screen, more enemies to take on and more upgrades and units being built in the background. All of this absolutely smashes the N64 limitations, and if you dare take a number of units to fight the enemy in one place on the map, then you can be certain that you're going to be seeing single-digit frame rates with all of the action going down. I'm not a stickler for frame rates, but in a game such as this, you need to be able to react quickly, which isn't always possible. There were times where I spent over an hour resource gathering and building my squad to go into battle, to be quickly wiped out because I couldn't pull back or select the right units in time with how slow the frame rate was. Now don't think the expansion pack will make a difference here, as it's not used to increase frame rates as it is in many other N64 titles. For a game which was designed around a mouse and keyboard input method, perhaps one of the most overlooked parts of the game was how well it controls, given that this port is designed for controllers. The analog stick does a decent job of moving your cursor around, but I would suggest instantly upping the sensitivity in the options menu, as the stock speed is pretty slow for most players. A core part of the PC experience was being able to quickly build units and have buildings hotkeyed for very quick access. The N64 doesn't have that luxury, but you can hotkey to the C buttons, which gives you some form of quick access. Sure, it's not as many as you'd want and often need, but it is better than nothing. In addition, there is a global build menu for both units and buildings, which wasn't in the PC version. This allows you to quickly load up from anywhere on the map instantly. In addition, it's actually quite smart, as if you have multiple buildings which do the same tasks, the global menu will automatically set the construction to balance the load capacity for speed. It's a decent time-saving function, and it's especially useful when you want to do tech upgrades, but don't want to have to travel all the way back to your base on screen to manually click the building and so on. In addition, there are also some cool control upgrades over the PC version. When you create a certain units, they'll automatically set out to work for you without you having to manually give them orders like you did in the PC game. This not only speeds up the gameplay, but it saves a huge amount of monotony and potentially giving you repetitive strain injuries, especially when you're first getting your game off the ground. The glaring elephant in the room, however, is this. Like Command & Conquer on N64, could have really benefited from the mouse and keyboard controls. I would have absolutely loved to have seen Nintendo repurpose the stockpile mice and keyboards from the failed N64 DD add-on and just bundle them into a special big box edition with Starcraft 64. Alternatively, this was just screaming out for a special edition release with maybe a custom gaming mouse with additional buttons to use as hotkeys, to try something to match the input abilities of the PC. But alas, what we got here works fine, and credit does go to Mass Media Entertainment for working out a more efficient way to force controller support in a way which does take some getting used to, but it works as well as can be expected in the grand scheme of things. Fans of ambient soundtracks will adore the game's music. You've been here long enough now to know that that's a style in games that I personally like, and given the lengthy time of the missions in-game, you'll really want something that's not overly aggressive and in your face, but something which complements the work that you're completing. If you stop to pay too much attention to it, you'll realise that the loop isn't actually that long. However, if you're in a mission which takes longer to complete, you may start to pick up on the cues and pacing changes which can start to become repetitive. The menus, however, have a nice, almost space industrial vibe to them. The sound is something more akin to Aubrey Hodges' work found in Doom 64, crossed maybe with elements of Vangelis. It's creepy, unsettling, but it fits the tension and building of the game's atmosphere perfectly. The effects in the game though is where it really shines. Every building and unit, every firefight and explosion sounds great, and you'll be hearing them a lot. My advice is to turn the game's music down and effects up to really make the most of it. It's natural that we didn't get the voice acting work, which would have been amazing, but given how much there was in the PC version, it was never going to happen on N64. Still, the short quips of your units make in gameplay are enough to keep you interested, and there's enough bass notes to really keep you pumped up. I said before that Starcraft 64 shouldn't be seen as a port of the PC game, so how should it be viewed? Well, for me personally, I see this more like a comparison to the PC game. It was never going to have all the bells and whistles that were possible with the massive power of PCs in the era when compared to the N64's power. But what it does offer is a stripped down user experience that has more limited appeal, but it doesn't mean it's not a brilliant game. In the same way as say Call of Duty mobiles these days is never going to replace the feeling of playing COD on a massive beast of a gaming PC, not everyone wants or has the ability to drop into the Warzone on a couple of $1,000 PC. The same was true in the year 2000. Not everyone had or wanted a beast of a PC. Many gamers were happy just sticking with one console, and if that console you had was the N64, then you're in luck, because you could still play the epic missions and engross yourself in the world of Starcraft with a system that cost 10 times less than a top-end PC for the year 2000. So what are your memories of Starcraft 64? Did you pick this one up in the day to get your next RTS itch scratched after Command & Conquer on the N64, or were you left swooning over the amazing overall package of the PC version and felt best to not lessen the experience by playing it on N64? What tweaks and changes would you have made to Starcraft 64 to make the overall experience better, and would you like to see Starcraft 64 get a modern day version along the lines of the wonderful work that Night Dive Studios have done with other N64 classics? As always, let me know your thoughts and feelings, comments and views down below, and until next time.